very well for the discussion, and thank also the UK mission and the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation for allowing us, Center for European Policy Studies, to co-organize this event. And I think we are deeply interested in that, in this topic, and we think it's the right moment to discuss not only what will happen in the UK, but also how the UK developments can relate to developments in other parts of the world, right? For the ones that don't know me, and I've been introduced already, but my name is Andrea Renda. I'm a senior fellow at CEPS. I'm also a professor of digital policy at the European University Institute, former member of the high-level expert group on AI when it existed in the European Commission, currently a member of the STOA advisory board at the European Parliament, and a member of the OECD network of AI experts. So many of these things have been mentioned, and I met some of you also in the context of these various fora that we are involved in, and currently also very much involved with CEPS in a partnership with Brookings on exploring avenues for international cooperation on AI. Something is a forum that involves 8 governments by now, including the UK, including the European Commission and the European Parliament, but also the United States, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Korea, and Japan. We are now also involved in the Trade and Technology Dialogue, which I'm going to coordinate basically as of this week for the next 3 years, supporting the 10 working groups in the EU Trade and Technology Council. So some of these things will be relevant, obviously, also for the UK going forward and for many of the speakers that we have here. So without further ado, I want to hear the comments that Axel Voss has for us. Axel is a member of the European Parliament since 2009, right? And now a rapporteur for the Jury Committee for the AI Act, something on which he has been working a little bit lately on, and also is the chair of the AIDA Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the European Parliament. That, in my opinion, but this is my opinion, has been an extremely good idea in the Parliament because it led to quite a lot of dialogue and coordination on such a complex dossier. So, Axel, I give you the floor for your comments on the presentations that you've heard so far.
Yes, thanks, Andrea, and also thanks to you for the invitation and the possibility. Unfortunately, I have to leave 10 to 12 already because of the votings. And yeah, I have to say, if we following the presentations, I'm very much agreeing that technical standards at least is the enabler for all the fantastic ideas what we have on ethical principles and fundamental rights and so on. And that's why I was really following your presentation regarding this one. So AI, we have to consider this is the booster of the digitalization, and it's a kind of key technology where everyone who is leading in AI, who might lead the world at the end. And so far, I would say Europe is not a kind of a global leader in this issue. We have talents, but we need to come up also with business models and so on. And this is what we are not doing quite well. That's why I think we have to step up and to concentrate and really to have political leadership here. Otherwise, I can't see that Europe is really coming forward if we are not setting all these framework and the standards and so on. And and I think speed and flexibility also as a legislator is required. And this is also what we are asking in this report to do so. Of course, we are also asking for only regulations in the digital area, and also for a digital common market, and taking this seriously, that also the European companies sorry, and the industry might have a good starting point at the end. And Europe can provide a lot to the world if we are combining values with technology. But this can be done, from my point of view, also only via standards to be more practical and yes, and to get a bit more speed on the road here. And these are all ideas that also a legislator has to change its ponderous proceedings to catch up with all these realities already existing and not afterwards. And you can see, if we are seeing the Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act, how hard it will be to implement something later on if everything is already going on. So that's why we have to improve ourselves. We have to make a plan or a kind of a concept, and adding investments, infrastructure, skills, and everything what we need to come forward and to be a kind of a good competitor in the world, and especially to the other both regions in the world who are very fast ongoing on this situation. And this is what we are thinking in the European Parliament, and what we would like to express also with this AIDA report. And now with the AIDA Act, it's getting more and more a bit complicated, because all of a sudden you have to face the ideological ideas, and this, from my point of view, should be seen more in a practical way, how we can support and improve the situation for the European businesses in also these digital and AI issues, and not coming with your own ideas how wonderful the world should be. So we can implement these, but we have also to think then the transferring these to this technology, and then we might come really good forward. I'm not always a fan of what the Commission sometimes is saying. If we are looking to the GDPR, or we have created the world standard, this is not my goal. I would like also to live in a kind of a prosperity and wealth environment somehow, and therefore we have to do here something, and just ignoring problems of the reality is not a good plan for the future.
Okay, thank you very much. So you would say, I prefer to be happy but not being the global leader, rather than being unhappy and claim to be the global leader. Okay, but you've seen that the European Commission has published a standardization work program for this year that includes a standard on auditing and supporting the conformity assessment on AI. So that it will be perhaps a point of contact. But I don't know if your perception is that the work is proceeding at the right speeds there.
Yeah, this is the problem. We always have these fantastic ideas, and probably the first one, but then we are starting to discuss and to balance and whatever it needs, and all of a sudden we are lagging behind. So this is why if we should more concentrate and prioritize, and also trying to be serious in coming forward, so that the TTC, for instance, should be a kind of an institution where we can step up with these standards, but they have to work steadily all the time and bringing us forward, because there is still a competitor in the world we have in mind with China. They are totally actively, they have a plan, and they are united in a way, and they are going forward, and we are not meeting them enough. So that's why this is a real challenge, and therefore the Western allies, the transatlantic allies, they should be aware of this situation, and they should, let's say, every evening sitting down and say, what way can we do better tomorrow?
Okay, thank you very much. And this is something perhaps when I bring in back some comments from our speakers, it will be interesting. Also, there's this letter G that we have in GPI, or we have in many other acronyms, that is global, right? It's almost never global, right? And also, so that is something that I would like to focus on a little bit later in the conversation, because obviously the UK has a legitimate ambition to become a hub for global standardization efforts. But how important is it that we keep the technical community truly global by involving also, for example, the Chinese? And how disruptive is the approach that China has had on standards, which is much more state-led and orchestrated than the one that traditionally we've cultivated as being bottom-up and multi-stakeholder, right? And is it possible to have a world in which there is a global multi-stakeholder movement for technical standards at this moment, or are we doomed to have some sort of forking in a technical standards going forward? That is very important for us. But you evoked also GDPR, so the inevitable follow-up for me is to call on Bojana Bellamy, who's the president of the Center for Information Policy Leadership, to tell us a little bit, as it's simple as, and you yourself have specialized quite a lot over the past years on GDPR and data protection in general. How do you see the assurance framework, but also the emerging framework at the EU level in this respect? So thank you, Bojana.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, and thank you very much to the UK mission and CDI for inviting us. And I think this is exactly what the kind of meeting we need to have, which is cross-border, international, global, where we are sharing these activities. And in fact, I'm very glad that we've got some industry present, because in fact, and I'll talk about that, there's a lot happening already in terms of best practice in industry. We have to build from that. But you asked me to comment on GDPR, and Axel knows, we've been working a lot on this. When you look at GDPR and AI, I mean, there has been always this tension between privacy principles and, of course, the way technology works. And we wrote about that in several papers. Of course, the rules on data minimization, the inability to use sensitive data to combat bias and discrimination under GDPR, perhaps also the purpose limitation. I mean, these are all principles that made sense once, but now in the new AI world, we need to rethink how we interpret them. It doesn't mean we need to redo them. It just means we need to reinterpret them so that they do work with these new technologies. So I am pleased to see in the AI regulation that we've got this nod to ability to use sensitive data to combat bias. And in fact, I think UK government is thinking the same way to, reform their regime. I know Dubai is thinking like that. And here, little by little, we are starting to see the impact of good idea going around the world. So that's very, very important. But nevertheless, there still are quite a lot of duplications. I work a lot with businesses and companies who have been developing privacy management programs and accountability under GDPR and have got privacy officers. And so now the question is, what do they do? I mean, do they shift and pivot all of that to AI? We don't want to have duplicative requirements. For example, data privacy impact assessment is something we need to do under GDPR. And frankly, even if you don't do it, it's a good practice to do it, because you want to see how you will be building a compliant product and service and what the impact is and risks and harms potentially that you can mitigate. And now we'll have to do the same on AI. And by the way, we'll have to do the same on children, and we might have to do the same on some other, like Data Act and DMA and so on. So the question becomes, how does a company put all of this together? Is the chief privacy officer now also AI responsible lead? No, clearly we've got one here, maybe here they're different, but can we leverage what we have done for GDPR to actually deliver our AI, responsible AI practices? And this is where I think there's a lot to be done on kind of assurance model, because under GDPR, we are also certifying potentially our products and services to be compliant. Now we'll have another AI certification. So we have to think a little bit. Records of processing, I don't like that bit in GDPR, but you have to call this record of processing, but the same is required kind of under AI as well. We've got transparency under both laws. So what does it mean to give AI transparency versus transparency under GDPR? There are going to be lots of practical things we will need to consider, and I wouldn't want us to duplicate legal requirements. And that's why I think standards are a very good way forward. I'm very much encouraged. First, I'm encouraged by sort of where Europe is going in terms of the bottom-up standardization, but surely what UK is doing as well. We at CEPL have always believed that the way to regulate these new areas is through some lighter tools, lighter touch rules based on standards and supplemented by standards, and critically organizational accountability. So to me, it's an onion, where you've got some basic rules, standards, and then how does organization implement these ethical values, principles, standards into operational controls that are measurable, enforceable, that are demonstrable as well, and that actually operationalize the fairness principle into something very, very concrete in our company. So I think I would like to see some nod in the regulation in the UK to those organizational accountability measures, because companies are producing that. We've seen quite a lot of work has been done already. And by the way, I do want to announce we will be launching a new project, another one, but looking at accountable best AI practices with organizations we work with, and hopefully doing evidence-based research and publishing something like we've done for privacy program. What does that accountability for AI look like? All of them may be doing different things, but going towards the same outcomes. And what we are seeing at the moment is that there is already quite a lot. We have got appointing responsible AI. We've got the governance structures. Julie Sweeter, CEO of Accenture, published just a fantastic blog recently talking about how C-suite needs a new playbook for AI. It's a little bit like 2008 financial crisis, where, the C-suite had no idea what the traders and derivative managers were cooking. And then all of a sudden it all crashed, the house of cards. Well, here, the C-suite needs to lead that. They need to have technical know-how and understanding to know what people on the ground are developing, what risks they're creating, in fact, and benefits that they're bringing as well. So the C-suite playbook, really interesting. We are seeing appointments of internal or external ethics advisory or AI advisory boards and committees. Again, interesting best practice. No law requires that, but companies are doing that because they think it's actually good. We've seen development of fairness tools, of AI impact assessment, even wider human rights impact assessment. Interesting model cards where developers of AI creating model cards which help those that are using their AI products understand how the transparency has been built. Natasha, I'm sure you'll talk about all of this. But to me, it really is encouraging. And what this means is that there is this bottom-up accountability. So I would like to see some incentives in the law by the regulators that incentivize these good practices. So if you're accountable, if you have got this assurance, you can provide services, you can engage in some new business. And if you're a startup who wants to be accountable, we're going to give you help. There are regulatory sandboxes for you. There are other help that we're going to give you to lift you up. So to me, it's not just assurance, which is how you demonstrate, but actually the organizational best practices that we need to work on at the moment. Once we have that, they will have to demonstrate both internally to their executives, to their boards, very important, but also externally to business partners, individuals, regulators, media, etc.
Well, Jana, just a follow-up question. How easy do you think is for smaller companies to implement these practices? Because typically a company like Microsoft, for example, can set up divide responsibilities. Is there a way, or is there a proposal that you have to ensure that, to some extent, what happened in GDPR doesn't happen with the new rules, both under the assurance framework and under the AI Act, so the smaller companies face enormous administrative burdens and compliance costs as a result of.
Andrea, this is $1 million question that we get at every single event globally as well, and every regulator, every country is trying to sort this out. I mean, to me, what big players are going to be doing is going to be fit for their purpose, right? They're big companies, they're creating lots of tools. The smaller are going to have to scale that up, but the conversation still needs to happen. You still, in a small startup, you still need to ask yourself, if we are going to be creating some risks and harms, but also big benefits, how do we actually design this product so that it does have some of these features? So they must have that conversation, but it probably will be just a conversation. It won't be board, it won't be privacy or AI officer. And then the question becomes, who do they go to have that conversation with? I mean, there were some interesting initiatives, the policy prototyping open loop initiative where 10 European startups were given some of the EU AI Act tools and guidelines to actually test how they would do an impact assessment. And they reported that, in fact, first of all, it was very useful to do an impact assessment. But secondly, they would not know how to do it unless there was some guidance, somebody holding their hand. So this means more agile regulator, more agile assurance, maybe these third-party assurance providers can be the ones to actually do a bit of hand-holding. So it's not just that we are checking what you do, it's also we are helping you put in place. And I do have to say, we in Europe must bear this in mind, because we talk about big American companies, but they were all startup once, you know, they've all grown out of that. So we need to absolutely make sure to help our own homebred businesses. And if that means government policy, if that means regulator who is particularly given priority, helpline, sandbox to the European startups, so be it. That to me is not protectionism. That to me is good industrial policy. But having tough rules against some companies, that is potentially protectionism, if I dare say.
Okay, thanks, Bojana. No, I'm happy to hear later, perhaps from Michael, how, you know, what's the impact of the assurance framework as in terms of larger versus smaller firms. So if you thought about that, being a UK, one of the lands of impact assessment, and think small first. I know that Axel will have to leave in a few minutes only. Will you have time to listen to Alberto's remarks, and then I can give you the floor, or you want to say something else, perhaps to respond to Bojana before you leave us? I think, yeah, probably it's better. We don't want to put, you know, too much pressure on you. Then otherwise you violate the 30 kilometers per hour speed limit in Brussels just to get to the European Parliament.
So thanks, Andrea. It's better to react now.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
So I totally agree. So far we are missing incentives, and but we can or could do a lot. But I'm not sure always you need the majority of the House at least to implement here something, and we would like to try. And I hope then we can come up with some of these ideas in trying to be better at the end. I'm not sure, but you need to have a kind of an openness also for the colleagues that they are bringing with them, and not sticking to their ideological ideas and so on. I hope we will get this. I'm still hoping that this might be a way forward. Regarding GDPR, as you know, I'm always criticizing these, that we should modernize these, should be more, or bringing this to a level where this is also in line with the new realities. As you mentioned, the principles, yes, it has been quite good last century. And if you're sticking only to data protection, of course, this might be a way forward. But now the reality is different. And we need personal data to train the algorithms. And therefore, I'm not quite sure how we can manage these controversial situations that we are asking for a result of an AI algorithm, that it should be non-biased, non-discriminatory, gender balanced, and so on, and not providing these data sets, because you need personal data to train these. And here we have to do something. And also, I would say, probably we can also build a kind of a obligation to the data protection authorities in saying, if you are not contributing to this during the developments, then you are out. You can't criticize afterwards. Something like this in this direction probably would be helpful also to support this development for our industry.
Thank you very much. So perhaps we should give an applause to Axel as he's leaving us now. And one day we will ask you the list of the people that are slowing you down. Okay, that would be unfair. Okay. So thanks a lot for being with us. So I'll turn to Alberto, Director of Infrastructure, Security and Privacy at Digital Europe. You might have quite a few comments on also what was said by Axel and Bojana, perhaps also on what was said there. Just a reflection before I give you the floor is, obviously we're seeing what the UK can do in terms of self and co-regulation, in terms of setting up governance processes, is something that the EU in and of itself cannot do because of the differences across member states, and the need to be a little bit more formalistic, a little bit more prescriptive regulation, which is inevitable when you have to put together different legal families and regimes and traditions and cultures and different levels of enforcement and so on and so forth. But I say, obviously, you might disagree with me. And so that is one thing that I would like to bring into the second part of this debate. So perhaps the two systems will inevitably, at some point, diverge because the UK can do things that are more cohesive in nature and require more cohesion as a starting point, meaning a closer relationship with stakeholder. But maybe you have a different view on this. Second thing is, I, having been heavily involved in the making of the AI Act by drafting the impact assessment and before this the ethics guidelines on trustworthy AI, do not consider the AI Act as inherently a heavily regulatory measure. But I know you probably disagree with me. First of all, the idea of being risk-based focuses the regulation on the high-risk AI applications, and obviously the European Commission said they're going to be between 5 and 10%, but there's no actual evidence that this is going to be the case. So maybe Alberto has a view on whether this would be more than that or not. And there's this idea that for the non-high risk, there's this possibility of having a voluntary code of conduct that perhaps goes in the direction that the UK is taking more generally. And the question that would be also for maybe for Michael, it would be on whether you consider the UK system to be risk-based in the same way as the EU is, or is more a continuum, if you wish, of proportionality rather than singling out only a few applications that you consider high risk and then you want to regulate them. So these are just to name a little bit of the differences. And Alberto, I give you the floor. I've spoken too much, and just to hear your views, and perhaps if you can echo also what you've heard until now from the other speakers.
Thank you, Andrea, for speaking so much. I have prepared remarks, but now that you've spoken, I'm actually going to change my remarks completely to address some of the points that you've made. So first of all, thank you for the invitation and the very interesting discussion that we've been having, at least so far. Now that I'm speaking, you said in particular that divergence is inevitable. I would fundamentally question that adjective in the sense that even within the European construct, there's a number of options that are available to the Commission. And the Commission has made a choice. It was not inevitable. It was not the only option to follow. It has made a choice, and it comes with pros and cons. Why it was a choice? It could have decided to do things a little bit softer. So, for example, one of the things that are happening in the UK is that we see a lot of the tensions, as Bojana explained, around AI actually come from the GDPR and how data, particularly personal data, is enabled for processing. And the UK in particular, as part of the UK GDPR reform, has been looking specifically at clarifications and changes in provisions that would touch on AI specifically. So that could have been more of an enabling sort of framework that was available as an option to the EU, but we have decided, the European Commission has largely decided to go for another option. Now, this inherently creates a risk of divergence by design, not purely because of time. But it requires us to be particularly careful from a European perspective as to whether we're doing the right thing. Because there's a lot of talk about divergence from the US, and also our UK colleagues are particularly worried about divergence. But this is particularly worrying for us Europeans, because if we get it wrong, the economy of creating AI applications and solutions will be very wrong for our companies. Our companies, it's all good and well to ensure safety and responsible development, but they will want to work in a global environment, and if we put them at a disadvantage by regulating wrongly or too much in Europe, they're not going to like it. So that's the first thing that we need to be very careful about. And as Voss and everybody else said, there's usually this reference to GDPR, and we're all very happy and proud that GDPR has become the global gold standard. I think everybody would agree with that, but we need to be careful, first of all, because it's not a given that it will happen again. Right? The fact that it happened once does not mean that the world will want to follow suit on every single piece of regulation that we come up with. And second of all, because we're trying to do the same in a number of spheres. So we're doing AI, we're doing Data Act, and there's going to be overlaps all over the place. We're doing cybersecurity. There's going to be a digital Cyber Resilience Act, all of which are linked to the topic of standards, particularly between cyber and AI. And the reason that this discussion is very interesting, both from an international perspective and a purely internal perspective for Europe, is precisely this link between regulation, so regulatory requirements, and attestation of conformity through standards. And this is another point where I sort of disagree with your view that it's not a heavy-handed sort of system, because we got ourselves into a pretty well-defined system of governance, which is the new legislative framework for those who have heard about it, which is placement on the market legislation in Europe. And we have decided that we're going to treat AI like we treat products, and have similar to how we make sure that voltage on any devices is not too high, that it'll electrify people when they're using a physical device. Now, the good thing about this system is that it's a system that Europe has invented. So we came up with the idea, and we came up with the idea that this should be a public-private partnership where we have policymakers who define what the legal essential requirements are, and then we let the European standards organizations deliver harmonized standards under strict controls. Again, this is not like a process where industry just goes about doing their own thing with no supervision. No, there's going to be standardization requests drafted by the European Commission that are going to be attached to the essential requirements that we'll have in the final AI Act, which we don't have yet. So we don't know exactly what the Commission will have to assess the standardization request against. Those will have to go through proper development with all the rules in a standardization regulation. We're going through the revision and reform of the standardization system as well, and the NLF as well, for that matter. And at the end of that process, the Commission will get to decide whether what the standards organizations have done effectively complies with standardization requests and with the essential requirements. So this process is very complicated. It's not like a walk in the park. So it is heavy-handed from that perspective. And it only works if all the elements in that chain work well. If we have inherently tensions at different steps of that process, and we have seen that that has happened in some NLF pieces of legislation, everybody will suffer, particularly from an industry perspective, because we'll have to go through the uncertainty of doing third-party attestation of conformity for a whole range of things. So it is a very tricky process to put ourselves into, and we need to make sure that everybody is doing their bits and not creating problems along the way. Bojana, I see you're very eager to speak. Please interrupt me.
Eager to say something.
But I think that Andrea is kind of right. Andrea, conceptually, the AI regulation as a concept is not heavy. But we've learned with GDPR, when you put words into law, there are these courts and European Court of Justice that do interpret this very strictly. And I think for those who are thinking about compliance measures and how do we comply, and I come from a country, and I was actually in a compliance role myself, companies read this stuff and say, well, actually, we have to do this. We have to, this isn't just, oh, we will do our best effort too. But this is a law, and if we don't do this, somebody's going to not buy our product or frankly, fine us, right? There'll be regulators. But let me just say about the high risk something. And Alberto, I will
ask you to be very short, because we've got Alberto and we still haven't heard from
Natasha. So the high risk, yes, it's very good that it's high risk. It's risk-based regulation. But if you look at the list of high risk, AI, biometrics is by default high risk, but AI will be used in biometrics in everything in 5 years. We will not have credit cards. We will not have passports. We'll be moving through passports seamlessly. We're already shopping in shops. In London, there is one you go through and you just buy. And so, workers management, there's a lot of AI that is used for allocating tasks. And so, is that really high risk? And where is the question of benefits here? How do we make sure we actually do not lose the benefits of doing something, deploying an AI application when we only focus on risk? Like that bit is missing for me from the regulation. And the list of AI is high risk could be very high as well, bigger than what GDPR Article 22 requires.
So I have two comments there, but I should want to let Alberto finish on those as well. One is, well, I actually do believe that in workers' management, we've seen very bad cases already in terms of supervising behavior in a very intrusive way. And algorithmic management, in particular in digital labor platforms, is creating a number of problems in terms of respect for individual fundamental rights. So I would disagree with you on that. But I'm actually not saying we're prohibiting these things. We are asking for an enhanced responsibility. And so thinking not only once, but twice, 3 times, depending on how many regulations you have to comply with, obviously, at whether you're actually generating risks or you have ways of mitigating them. So I'll get to Natasha on this. So that's one thing. The thing on which I wanted to sort of build a dialectic and some dialogue with Alberto is the fact that, after all, in the AI Act, most of the compliance is taking place, well, apart from the case in which product safety legislation applies, the rest takes place through internal checks, right? So it's actually very much of a self-assessment rather than going to a notified body and having it checked in the garage. So that's why I'm saying I don't see, actually, I know many people that are disappointed by how non-regulatory or non-prescriptive or non-top-down command and control this regulation is, and how not too different from the assurance framework in the UK it eventually is. So I'm playing a little bit with the divergence convergence there, because I think the more we peel the onion, the more we might realize that we are taking perhaps the problem from 2 different angles, but we're actually converging on something that is not too different in the end. But obviously, Alberto will be completely disagreeing with me, and this is why we have the debates. Adding this, the other thing is my conversation with the Commission when I was writing the impact assessment is really very much along those lines. Actually, the AI Act is important for what it cannot say and what it should not say, just like the assurance framework cannot go into each and every detail. What is very important in a regulation like the AI Act is that it sets in motion a governance process or a governance system where the mitigating measures, the best practices in the market that might warrant even moving specific applications and use cases from high risk to no risk, or from prohibition to high risk, depending on how of the governance and organizational measures, which are also part of standards that you build around this. You know, the system that will decide on a daily basis how the body of knowledge on what is the good practice on AI evolves and is constantly taken up by maybe the AI board in the future, you know, through guidance. You know, this is the most important system, because the list of cases that we have are just a starting point. They might be completely different even by the time this legislation enters into force. But sorry, Alberto, and Natasha deserves then a 3-hour speech, like with no possibility of exiting the room. Alberto, just if you can close in 1 minute also on this.
No, absolutely. I think the tricky part there is, though, that, you know, for all the internal controls, et cetera, the whole system is still going to be based, hopefully, on the existence of harmonized standards. And again, this is not a process that's linear. We'll go into discussions with the Commission and the standards organizations as to exactly what should be in those standards, how you can effectively put the legal requirements into standards. And now, as a consequence of that, companies will internally be able to show compliance. So it's not a straightforward process. That's my main point. And from an international perspective, because we're going into the creation of legal requirements now, at some point we'll know exactly what's going to be in the letter of the law. This is what will guide the Commission. They will have a mandate to stick to that. We're creating legal requirements before the international standards are mapped to any legal requirements. So there is a risk already of divergence there. So which is why bilateral and multilateral fora, the TTC you mentioned, very important, focusing very much on standards. AI is one of them, and cyber is another one. Very important, because we need to talk honestly to each other now and try to align now before it's too late.
Yeah, indeed. Well, as Coldplay would say, nobody said it was easy, right? And it's not going to be easy. I agree. It's going to be a fascinating journey, and still the endpoint depends very much on, again, the ability of the standardization process to incorporate values, legislation, international efforts, and so on and so forth, which leads me to Natasha, who's been very patiently waiting for her turn. Chief AI Responsible Officer in Microsoft. So you've been evoked several times. And we pretended we knew everything, but you are the one that should know everything about this, because you're the one that actually is going to do this in practice. So Natasha, we're happy to have you with us and eager to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the invitation. Look, it's very clear that we're at this critical norm-setting moment when it comes to AI, and clearly, you know, the AI Act here in Europe has really prompted some real debate about the futures that we have ahead of us. But there are other really important developments in train as well. So, for example, in the US, NIST, the national standards body in the US, has developed an AI risk management framework that has some parallels with the European approach, but also diverges in some material ways. You know, we're expecting then with anticipation the UK framework, same in Australia, same in South Korea. China has laws on the books now for recommendation systems, which are very interesting in a number of respects. So I do think this is absolutely the right time to be having the conversation about how we can accelerate the bringing together of these efforts and try and find those commonalities, because I do think there are instances where we might be talking past one another. And I think there are instances where there might actually still be quite different philosophical divergences, but we should have those conversations to understand where they lie. On the topic of the, you know, assurance ecosystem specifically, I think that this is incredibly important that we try and mature this ecosystem very, very quickly. And the reason for this is that in addition to being clearly a material way to build the justified trust that we know is necessary in this space, I think working on the assurance ecosystem and continuing to contribute to those standards can really help us inform our own thinking about what the right regulatory approaches here are. And part of this is that, and you know, clearly I come from a place where I'm, you know, helping Microsoft with its own implementation efforts. By working through practical examples of how to assure a particular system, in the same way that within Microsoft we work through practical examples of how to live up to our principles, you learn a lot. You learn about the difference between sort of responsible AI in theory and responsible AI in practice. And here I think there are just these three really key attributes of AI systems that we've just got to keep top of mind as we're maturing the assurance ecosystem, as we're maturing the standards ecosystem, as we're thinking about what the right regulatory approaches are. I think first, it's very tempting to often think of AI systems in a very kind of technical sense, and particularly when it comes to assurance. I think the mind immediately goes to very quantifiable ways of testing the technical behavior of an AI system. But what's so important to recognize here is that AI systems are not just technical systems, they're socio-technical systems. And it was really encouraging to hear Stephanie mention this in her way of thinking about standards. What this means is that we're talking about systems that are about people and technology. And so when we assure systems, when we're developing standards for systems, when we're thinking about regulating systems, we really need to think about the human and AI team together, and not as sort of two distinct components. Because if we're really concerned about driving sort of effective outcomes here, we need to think about the people components as well as the technology components. So that's the first sort of key characteristic I'd point to. I think the second element here is that you know, we need to recognize that AI systems can be created in a multitude of different ways, and there are contributions from a number of different actors. And what this means is that we actually need assurance mechanisms, standards mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms that can flex across different types of development and deployment models. Because who is doing what and how responsibilities should be allocated actually varies significantly depending on the way in which the system at hand is assembled. And so I think thinking about the inherent flexibility and concepts around, sort of modular approaches, I think is really important. The final aspect that I just want to point to here is that I think it's very important to recognize that we have a very dynamic situation that we need to be thinking about at all times. So first of all, the pace of technology is, the breakthroughs are coming at a rate that is surprising even AI experts. So we've got fast moving technology, and we need to think about not just how to best regulate the systems that we have today, but we need to think about the future technology directions and make sure that we are adopting approaches as much as we can that are sort of forward-looking and future-proof so that we can accommodate those developments. But relatedly, the actual practice of responsible AI, so the methods and the approaches and the techniques that we are using to make sure that systems are fair, that they are transparent, that there is a good interaction between the human and AI components of AI systems, these are still nascent. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's, really encouraging efforts to be recognized across the ecosystem, but they're early and they will mature. So, what is today best practice for, conducting a disaggregated evaluation of a system from a fairness point of view may not be best practice, some years from now as we get even more experience in doing that. And I think just making sure that we've got these sort of key characteristics of AI systems front and center when we're thinking about the different approaches is really a critical dimension to getting this right. Because I think, there's really, I think, little disagreement. In fact, I'd say there's a lot of convergence about the sort of policy outcomes we want to secure. And now our job is really to figure out what are the most effective, what are the most efficient ways in which to secure those policy outcomes, bearing in mind these sort of unique characteristics of AI systems.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I will ask you a question about smaller companies, and because that's one of the main concerns when you introduce new obligations in the market is, Microsoft already has put in place several steps to comply with its own values and its own principles on responsible AI development. Other companies, do internal certification or help other smaller companies follow those principles. Do you see this happening in the future in the market? I mean, you see larger companies, even if, in particular when they develop but not ultimately deploy the AI system, will provide assistance to the companies that will use then maybe pre-trained algorithms to deploy them on the market or not?
I believe they can and they should. So, as speaking, on behalf of Microsoft, we make available a lot of platform technologies, right? We make available general purpose computer vision and speech technologies, language technologies. And I really do think with AI systems, developers of these platform technologies are going to need to take on new responsibilities to provide certain types of information and knowledge to deploying entities to make sure that responsible deployment choices are made. And this is a change for us. When we think about what we might have done in the past when we were boxing up Microsoft Word and putting it on shelves, the most that you got from us was probably a, help file, a README file, and some maybe engagement on an online forum about how to use the technology. This type of model is not going to work for AI systems. And in fact, as the developers of the model, we have special knowledge about the way in which the models were developed. It's very important for us to convey to deploying entities. Just to give you a concrete example of how that's materialized in practice, we've done quite a lot of work on facial recognition technology, and we've long held the view that facial recognition technology presents special risks such that it needs to be regulated. But we haven't just called for regulation, we've also adopted and implemented principles within the company as well. And as we were implementing those principles, we were looking into the nature of the documentation that we were providing to our customers about the facial recognition technology that we produce. And what we found is that we had two types of documentation. On the one hand, we had marketing documentation, which was sort of, as you could imagine, sort of touting the benefits of the technology, talking about the different use cases in which it could be applied. And on the other hand, we had very technical documentation that was valuable if you were the person implementing the technology in a particular system. But what we realized is that we needed documentation in the middle that would thread the needle on the ethical implications of the technology and how to deploy it responsibly. So we actually created a new type of documentation that we've now prepared across a number of our platform services. We call them transparency notes. And they're documents that we prepare that in very sort of plain language terms that can be understood by a non-expert explain important things to know about the technology that we're making available. What is a false positive when it comes to facial recognition technology? What is a false negative? Why do you need to think about the trade-off between those two things differently in the context of different use cases? As an entity deploying the technology, what do I need to know? You need to know things like image quality really affects the performance of the technology. So we need to share that kind of information in order to be able to help deploying entities make the right choices. One other dimension I think we'll see proliferate, and Microsoft is very much prepared to do its part here as well, is that, you know, we've already started to see some tooling be developed. We have a number of toolkits that help with, you know, fairness, interpretability. These sorts of toolkits are very often made available open source. They're also integrated into development platforms. And I think that's kind of a scalable way to help smaller organizations as well, to make available that tooling so that they can get the benefit of it as well.
Thank you very much. And I've seen several companies being active also, for example, in the OECD network of AI experts, where the tools for accountability are being discussed, actually part of that expert group. So I see that happening on a daily basis. Since I think it's about time to open up to questions, I want to look at that part of the room to, first of all, Ray and Marty, if you have questions that are lined up online, please feel free to signal. So far, no questions. And as I promised, I bring back into, since otherwise they get bored, Michael and Stephanie, it would actually be good if we could add another chair there, but and so that you could come over and have a discussion with us. Or Stephanie, you want to take this one, and perhaps then you swap with Michael, or
yeah, I think we'll.
Okay, so Stephanie, Stephanie, first of all, more generally, I can give you the floor for you to echo what you've heard, and perhaps you can have a little bit of a conversation, and then I will perhaps ask those of you that are here physically present in the flesh to signal whether you have questions or comments that you want to make. So can you signal that now so that I know more or less how many? 1, 2, 3, and 4. You there as well, right? Okay. So we have quite a lot of questions, but first we hear from Stephanie, and then we will get a possibility for you collect the questions, and everybody will have a chance to have a final round.
I think a lot was covered, actually, so I won't try to respond to absolutely everything, and I think we can pick up questions as they come in. But overall, I think we heard a lot about the importance of sort of the global approach. So I think we feel sort of reassured about the importance of the value that global standards might bring, whether it be in terms of the compliance that you spoke about, or whether it be to create sort of definitions that might help for some of the transparency.
That must have been a good idea because the light came out.
That you just spoke about. But I think one of the interesting parts is that we might have sort of internal approaches, so sort of the approaches that you just discussed at Microsoft. But I think even in those cases, you know, what is the definition, or what do we agree about the interpretability or the explainability of that documentation? And so I think, as you said, it will actually take a long time potentially to get to that socio-technical sort of outcome. So it's fantastic to see sort of these tools being developed, but I think also in the long term, what role will AI technical standards continue to play in the future? So I think that was a sort of interesting.
I have a question that you'll hate, obviously, but you know, you're so knowledgeable that we can improvise easily, right? Well, my fundamental doubt about standards is that perhaps the standardization process is too slow for AI. So telling this to someone who's actually working on standards is not the best, the most polite thing you might want to do. But do you have ideas on how to speed up the standardization process or to make it more agile, which is a term that in the world of governance is becoming very, very prominent today?
Yeah, I think this is something that standards bodies are, of course, very attuned to. And so I think that there are many different proposals being sort of discussed about the future. So one of the things we often hear a lot is the sort of machine readable standards for the future might be something that, even though if it takes a while to sort of develop them, they might be sort of more easily implementable. And so I do think that there are proposals that are that people are thinking about that could add value in terms of the agility, but also how organizations might use standards. But in terms of the speed, I can't speak to how this might change. I think it's something that we'll all be watching, but something that we are doing in the UK is thinking about how do we sort of convene ourselves to sort of ensure that once we are at the different sort of junctures of different parts of standardization, we know what we might want to say. So, for example, how do we get the research and the civil society community in the UK and some of the experts, such as the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Alan Turing Institute, thinking about what we might want. So, for example, even if we are potentially at the foundational standard stage for different things, such as transparency or accuracy, when we get to the end where we're getting more towards performance, are there discussions that we can have now that might aid that discussion when we get to it? So all to say, I can't promise anything about speed, but I know standards bodies are thinking about new approaches. And I think as government, what we are doing in the UK is thinking about how might we ensure that we can contribute to that discussion early.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Natasha, I want to say something. I just wanted to echo one thing, or maybe offer a thought, which is it might be that as the pace of technological development increases, because that's not the end of it, it's going to further accelerate in many respects. Emphasis will be placed much more on organizational standards and a little bit less on very prescriptive product-related, technical feature-related standards. I've heard you already, but also in other settings, many standardization experts evoking the need for having more multi-stakeholder participation in standardization. So once this process is over, I wonder whether standardization has not become a new form of regulation, meaning a new, more similar to the regulatory process, a more inclusive, more, say, compliance-based in terms of organizations and so on, and a little bit less technical in nature, right?
Yeah, and just to actually follow that, one thing I didn't mention, of course, is process standards. This might be something that you'll speak to, but of course there are different types of standards, and process standards such as management system standards, for example, might be more adaptable, more flexible for the future. And so I think we have to think about, which of the things are that we will define and that we might not even need to adapt, but we might need to adapt. But then there are also approaches that, a lot of people are contributing to, like process standards that allow for that sort of future readaptation and continuous evolvement, which I think is really important. But pass.
I do agree that management system type standards are going to be really important here. I think in addition to talking about the agility and speed with which we're developing standards and indeed hard regulations as well, I think it's really important to embrace an iterative approach where we're not waiting until we have, the perfect, sort of proposal on paper, but we're really working in a much more engaged way with organizations actually implementing regulatory frameworks or proposed standards to learn whether, and quickly and early, as to whether in practice, when they're being implemented, we're actually securing the policy outcomes that we hope to. One thing I've learned from Microsoft's own internal practice of responsible AI is that sometimes there can be a gap between what you think is the right approach on paper and how it actually works in practice. And so we've developed our own set of product development rules over the course of a number of years. We've found it incredibly beneficial to take our policies, or first of all, co-develop the policies with engineering teams, with researchers, with policy teams, but then to actually put it to the test before we finalize it and really learn from those experiments, essentially, as to whether we are in fact securing the policy outcomes that we want to. And I think that notion of sort of testing and iterating and improving is just going to be an essential part of an effective response here.
Thank you very much, Natasha. That's a very enjoyable conversation. I will give the floor to our panelists for like a 30-second wrap up at the end. I want to collect the questions that we have in the room with a prayer to be as concise as possible. How much am I disrupting the agenda? So from 1 to 10, 15? 6 minutes left. So you actually have to be very concise in your questions. So we collect all the questions that are available. Do you want to start there from the? Yeah. And thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is José Renato. One thing that I would like to ask is, especially for instance, if we look at the report of the Code Committee in the AI Act, they also talk about maybe obligations regarding the environmental effects, like documenting on how this would be dealt with by companies and by those in the life cycle of AI systems in general. How do you see this? Like, okay, we know that it's quite hard to measure it at this point, but maybe how do you think this in the future might be something to be complied by? So, yes.
Okay, can you pass the microphone over to, yes.
Hi, everyone. Georgia Vulcano from ABM Bev. I work in digital ethics. So for me, one of the biggest challenges is, and I think it came up a lot today, we're talking about global standards, right? But how do we ensure we respect those local nuances? Natasha, you're referring to finding commonalities and bringing together efforts. How do we do it that, right? Particularly starting already within the startup world or the industries or the companies, right? How do we do that in practice?
All right, we had a question here. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Owen Larter in Natasha's team at Microsoft. It was a question on testing as part of this assurance discussion. What's the role of testing systems to make sure that they're demonstrating appropriately? And a question on standards as part of that. What kind of standards do we need to develop to allow that type of effective testing at scale?
Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emily Sandorf. I work for Tech UK, which is kind of the Digital Europe of the UK. And my question is kind of around how driving demand for assurance tools and services. So that's something we work with the CDI to kind of create. And one driver might be regulation, and another driver could be that your customers are kind of requiring that you've done assurance. But a challenge there is like the level of, I guess, expertise of AI customers, and how do they know what to look for if something, whether or not something is assured, especially if we're waiting for standards that are further down the line. Like, how do we kind of educate customers almost to ask the right questions and to go for assured, like quality assured AI in a way?
Very good. So we got these 4 questions. I'm going to ask Natasha to start, and we go all the way through Stephanie, and then we'll wrap up with her.
All right. This is quite the challenge. Okay.
And in 1 minute, max.
So I think the question about, measurement when it comes to, say, the carbon footprint of systems used to train AI models, this is a very important question, and it illustrates the importance of working on these measurement challenges, because in the absence of sort of common methodologies and metrics, it's very hard to have a sensible conversation about what good looks like, what better looks like. I think in terms of, trying to make sure that you account for, local values and considerations as well. I think one reality about AI systems that we should just talk more about is that you have to make choices. Like, you can't do all of the things all of the time. Definitions of fairness can be incompatible with one another. So I think part of the way to cutting through that is to actually just be explicit about the choices that have been made. And I think that's really important. I will skip over Owen's question and let others take that. I think finally on sort of, what do we need to do to make sure that there is justified trust in AI systems, including by non-experts, is that we do have to find ways of communicating trust that don't actually require deep, AI expertise. And, other industries have achieved that over time, but I think we have to push ourselves to go in that direction.
Thank you, Natasha.
Okay.
Bojana.
Very, very quickly then. So how do we ensure local versus global? I think this is really hard, but in some ways, that's why you have to test things. That's why you have to have focus groups. That's why you need diverse teams as well who are developing tools. That's why you need diverse data sets. That's why we need data flows, dare I say, as well, because otherwise we won't be able to have that diversity. And I actually think there is more than actually puts us together than puts us apart. Although I was at an OECD event on data ethics, it was an interesting professor from Japan who talked about dynamic harmony. And she talked, that's actually the Eastern way of thinking about things. We are very individualist, perhaps in the West, but in East, it's all about bigger benefit, bigger harmony. But I think that's really important for AI. How does this build benefits for society, for people, for whatever we are trying to do versus just, addressing risks? So I think we actually probably approaching on that one. On environmental point, I'm seeing companies doing a global, wider human rights impact assessment already. And I think it's very difficult, but you do have to think about a bigger picture. Even GDPR almost requires you to look at fundamental rights. I think we need AI to actually ensure environmental protection. So if we need more data for that, so be it. These are trade-offs, but also benefits that we need to talk about. I think there will be demand for assurance. I used to work in the private sector where we actually developed sort of a privacy program as an outsourcer, an IT service provider, when there was no assurance. And we asked the BSI to create something special for us so we could have this seal in the conversations, negotiations. And that helped us so much cut through the negotiation. People were not focusing on what liability we have. They were focusing on, look, here is what we're actually going to do as a good service provider. And I think that's really, Microsoft, massive cloud provider, they need to do this because otherwise they will not have a good business. And that's where it's going to come from. And I think there will be demand for this, but not make it too complex for SMEs. Otherwise, they're going to drown in the sort of group of requirements. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Over lunch.
So I'm not worried about standardization being too slow because in Europe we have a big stake, which is regulation, which is going to be a big incentive for everybody to get it done. But there are important questions that we need to solve. Testability, for example. I'm effectively just out of a discussion on a delegated act on the radio equipment directive, where we had a standardization mandate, and we had the issue of how do you prove that you're not using a default password for cybersecurity? That's not an easy question to solve in the context of the NLF and how you can prove compliance with technical standards. So we need a level of flexibility. We need a level of flexibility in what is written in the regulation that the standards and the standardization request can comply with, and we'll need flexibility from the Commission to move toward the more systems-based standards that we have been discussing. Because so far, from a legal perspective, and I'm sorry to be bothering everybody with legal details, but we're still dealing with case law and the Elliott case that have given the Commission a very strict interpretation about what harmonized standards should be doing. We need to get away from that discussion into a more practical discussion in order to have good harmonized standards for AI. That's me.
Thank you. And Stephanie, over to you.
I think the panel have picked up the questions excellently, but to follow up on two of the points, I think the local versus international question is an interesting one. And I think not to make the tackling the challenge any easier, but I do think we do have to focus on both sides. So from the international perspective, I think, in standards, we talk about the importance of interoperability, also the trustability of systems across borders. So you want to, as a citizen of a country, also know that the way AI systems are used in other jurisdictions also is safe and secure and accurate. And so I do think there's an importance around the international side, but from a local perspective, I think that's also very important and probably might be captured in the future through sort of different legal models. And then you can have synergies potentially through standards that help you sort of take those local potential differences, if there were to be some, and think about how they sort of work together. But I think one thing we didn't necessarily discuss as much as the horizontal versus vertical approach to standards. And so importantly, it will also be not just local and international, but how do you take horizontal standards, for example, for accuracy, but reapply them to vertical sectors. So how do we think about the use cases for medical devices versus robotics versus autonomous vehicles? I think that would be also important. And then going back to how I'll end is on the question around how we train civil society and ensure that they understand assurance. And that's a plug, of course, back to the presentation on the AI Standards Hub in the UK, which is where we take that very seriously. And I think the training part of the platform is really how do we give people the tools, how do we upskill folks in understanding what assurance even means, but also how do you provide tools on measurement. And so that's definitely something we're thinking about in the UK, and I think is a nice way to end on my side.
Yeah, and to end on everybody's side, I guess, unless Andrew, do you want to say something to wrap up, or we wrap up directly the Okay, so please come. If this is for thanking us, then obviously you're welcome.
Yes. Yeah, this one works too. Yeah, no, look, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Andrea, for facilitating this. Thank you, thank you to all the panelists. Thanks everyone for coming. I think what this teaches me definitely is that this is really an area that's ripe for continued collaboration, continued discussion. And from the UK's point of view, I think I'd say this is not an area of where we would focus on anything like regulatory competition. This is 100% about getting those discussions happening globally. We are, to answer Andrea's question earlier, we're very proud of our AI industry in the UK, but I think all jurisdictions should be an AI hub. The size of the pie here is massive, and the benefits to society could be absolutely immense as long as you have the proper safeguards in place. So once again, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks very much to our panelists as well.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Thank you. I hope people can see us online.